Today, we become legends.
In the heart of lockdowns, April 2020, the Smite player base was graced with quite possibly one of the most underpowered god releases of all time. Baba Yaga's release was interesting to say the least. Many mechanics she now holds simply didn't exist at her release in 2020, and basically every one of her numbers has been bumped up over the years. This god had actually never been outright nerfed until the most recent patch 10.9. Prior to that, she had only ever been buffed or shifted. But how on earth did this god go from an absolute joke at release to one of the top mid laners in the entire game? This is the story of how Baba Yaga made the greatest comeback in Smite history. So unlike Raven in the previous episode, Baba's core design has not changed. She hasn't been reworked or changed class, just made 10 times stronger than she was at launch, but we aren't even starting at her launch today. Because Baba's ridiculous train of buffs actually started in pre-release, where her 1's damage and scaling were bumped up. The scaling is negligible, but the base damage went from 185 to 300, which is a huge deal. I respect that this god was the first one to ever be made completely remote under lockdown restrictions, but unless COVID is some sort of brain fungus, I have no idea how they thought 185 base damage on a mage ability would do the trick. Hebo's 1 does almost twice that and is on a 3-second cooldown. This was fixed in pre-release though, as they bumped the damage up to 300, so let's move on to some post-launch changes. And oh boy was Baba's launch patch interesting. Literally in the same patch she released, this happened. Yeah, this god was so unfathomably bad on launch that they had to buff her in 7 different ways without even waiting for the next patch to roll around. That's like a god released in the modern day being buffed immediately in the next bonus balance patch, not even the next full patch. This is definitely one of the biggest single buff patches to ever happen in Smite history, and while it only touches 2 abilities, one of those was the ultimate, which is honestly a microcosm of Baba Yaga's entire story. On launch, Home Sweet Home was an ultimate that was joked about for being not even worth using because it disabled your basic abilities and did almost nothing for you.
True, and yeah, that's pretty true. That's true, and yeah, that's true. That's true. That's true. That's pretty true.
Well, in this patch that certainly got a little better, as the burst damage scaling, and burn damage scaling were all increased, as well as the travel time for the bolts was lowered pretty massively, and she gained 10% power scaling to her shield. The travel time buff cannot be understated. It might seem small in text form, but it made the ability infinitely easier to land, as before it took almost a whole second for the bolt to hit its target, at which point they probably moved out of the area, so you had to significantly lead your shots, whereas now you can mostly just yeet those blasts right at your enemies. This change is what made that happen. 7.5 brought some important bug fixes, which while not direct buffs, definitely made Baba a lot better to play. These include fixing the casting bugs on her 2 and ultimate, which were super annoying at launch. It felt like a solid 1/3 of the time you tried to activate these abilities, they just didn't go off. Next up in 7.6, some more actual buffs came Baba's way. She finally got the knock-up immunity and damage reduction on her 3, which was a huge deal. Beforehand, it was insanely easy to knock her out of this ability in the very long charge-up animation, and she was very much a sitting duck while doing it, so the damage mitigations helped her not insta-die while she tried to get away from a dive. They also removed the backpedal and strafing penalties on her ultimate, which made chasing and juking while she fired the bolts so much better, overall reducing the damage she takes while ulting drastically. They also decreased the minimum fire range, so she had an easier time dealing with melee gods while she was ulting. Before this, it was nearly impossible to properly target melee gods on her since she could only fire the bolts slightly far away from her. Now she can do them basically on top of herself to prevent melee gods shredding her in her ultimate. Another patch in a row of buffs came in 7.7, where her base damage on brew and shield health on the ultimate were bumped up slightly, followed in 7.9 by a cooldown decrease on Baba's brew, allowing her to more freely use it and better potential to store potions for a big team fight. 8.2 once again improved on her potion mechanics by altering several metrics like pre-fire and post-fire times to make it a lot easier to throw potions and to swap potions. This change pretty much single-handedly allowed Baba to do the double potion burst combos she now can. Beforehand, it was extremely clunky and took well over a second to get out and throw a second potion after the first one. 8.7 brought a lower cooldown to her movement ability, which is always nice for a mage, as well as massively buffing the shield health scaling and knockback strength of the initial hit of her ultimate. This made her a lot more safe when using it, as she could knock away junglers and solo laners that were diving her, and now had a much larger health shield, which is pretty much where it remains today. Patch 8.8 enabled Baba to walk through minions in her ultimate, which is a fairly small change, but can make a big difference difference in lane fights and was just really good for quality of life when playing Baba. The Season 9 launch patch once again brought some buffs to her ultimate as they removed the self route on fire, which made it a lot easier to chase down afterwards with the witch firebolts, or even to run away and create some space while you knock a diver away from you. They also buffed the base damage of her potions in this patch as well. Speaking of potions, patches 9.5 and 10.3 sort of combine here as they reduce the potion cooldown to 12 seconds and then to 10 seconds, which is pretty insane, given she can store a potion, so essentially a double cast of this ability in most fights if you're playing correctly. That's a base 6-second cooldown with max CDR for reference. At launch, this ability was a 16-second cooldown. However, 10.3 was the healing reduction patch, and therefore Baba Yaga received her first nerf since launch, which decreased the healing of her cabin when she didn't need stacks. I don't really count this though, as it was more of a shift. All the healing in the game got reduced, so comparatively she didn't get that much weaker, and they compensated her well with a 10-second cooldown on her too. Also, it's not a specific change to Baba herself, but the release of Prophetic Cloak in the Year 10 launch patch was a huge deal for her, as that item has been a main build for her ever since and makes her ridiculously tanky for the price of just one build slot. This combined with her ultimate makes her surprisingly safe given how much damage she can put out. But finally, we end our journey off in 10.9 where Baba got her first real nerfs of her entire existence. The burst damage and shield health of her ultimate were taken down slightly. Baba Yaga's story is an interesting one. She released so unbelievably bad that it took pretty much 3 years of non-stop buffs and new things being added to her before she became a meta threat. Sure, she was probably viable about halfway through these changes, but they just didn't stop, and she didn't either, becoming an unstoppable force in the meta for honestly quite a long time before receiving her first ever nerf in the Season of Celebration launch patch recently. Will she need more nerfs, or is she fine where she is? Let me know in the comments down below, and I'll catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.